Welcome back. The SABC made a loss of approximately 1.1 billion rand for the 2022-2023 financial year. The Public Broadcasters Board and members of the executive briefed Parliament on its fourth quarter expenditure and financial reports. They say they have not given up on negotiations with MultiChoice to broadcast the 2023 Rugby World Cup. For more on this, we are now joined on our line with Mpho Ndaba. He is from Media and Society. Mpho, thank you so much for joining us here on the late edition. I'm going to rehash my question to you just before we went to the break. Of course, a loss of 1.1 billion rand for the public broadcaster. One would say it's very concerning, considering, the retrenchments we saw at the public broadcaster.
It is quite concerning. Good evening to your listeners. It is, and it's a sad situation, I should say, primarily because you know that prior to the new board coming into taking up this responsibility of trying to manage the SABC, there was quite substantial work that civil society organizations such as the Media Monitoring Africa and SOS Coalition had done to try and really ensure that we don't find ourselves in the same position again. And I think we need to also contextualize this issue, right, by taking into consideration the fact that all this is happening when the country is getting ready for the national elections. So, outside of the question around access to information and sports and entertainment, which is the responsibility of the SABC, the election question is also a major one, because what that means is that the SABC potentially doesn't have the capacity and the infrastructure to meet the kinds of demands that often come in every 5 years whenever there is a national elections, especially because we also know that these elections are quite pivotal. I mean, we've seen scholars and activists and writers really, deliberating on the fact that this is probably one of the elections that really could be transformative for the South African society. So it is quite concerning.
And, one would ask, what are the contributing factors here to the fact that the SABC seems to be, losing money? I know that during the 2021-2022 fiscal year, there was a loss of about 201 million rand and an increase to 1 billion rand. One would ask, and, some of the publications even saying that, it seems as if these publications say that it may even lead to the management of the SABC. Can we put this on the management of the SABC?
I think we have to be careful in our analysis, and this is what I mean. Before the new board could be put in place, this current board, there was quite a bit of work, advocacy work, legal work, in fact, even in the form of litigation that civil society organizations were doing, and I'm sure for the viewers of the SABC, this is common knowledge, especially when you consider the fact that some of the things that needed to be put in place in order to ensure a smooth transition took time. I mean, the office of the president, of course, gave arguments as to why they couldn't appoint the new board, and I mentioned this question of the appointment of the new board primarily because when you talk about the financial sustainability of an institution, you need to be able to firstly account to Parliament and really speak to the questions around strategy, for an example. So I think my point is that if we were to say that there is a sense of political instability at the SABC, government also has to take responsibility, especially this current administration, primarily because there was a sense initially after the Claudia Motsoeneng's administration that things were being steered at the right direction, right? And of course, I mean, we even saw this in the earlier reports when the new board came into play, the last board rather, that they were trying to ensure that the SABC gets to put in place the relevant infrastructure finance-wise to ensure that it also competes which is also a very problematic thing to say, I should say, because of the landscape of the South African media, but also the global political economy of media in general. The COVID pandemic, and I know that the colleagues when they were presenting to Parliament, they mentioned this, that the COVID pandemic had an impact in terms of to get advertiser spend. For example, we know that many companies retrenched, and you earlier even mentioned this point to say that why is it that if the SABC retrenched on the basis that it was trying to ensure that it has a good balanced sheet, then we have this situation again. So I think, it requires us, our analysis requires us to consider all the possible factors, but it doesn't mean that even when we engage in that kind of deliberation, that everyone is operating with good faith, right? This is the point I would make in a broad sense, and it's a speculation at this point, to say that even though there is a backing that we can look at historically in terms of how the SABC has been destabilized, the instability of the SABC is necessary for some political parties to be able to thrive, right? So I think in my head, in as much as it's a bad thing, but it makes sense for the SABC not to be in a good financial position, primarily because that state of affairs allow people to be able to feed off of that instability.
Yeah.
So I think, look, I mean, this is a question that we've been engaging with for years and years and years. In fact, it's one of, if you were to compare with other organizations that not necessarily state-owned institutions, because the SABC has an interesting, quite unique position. If you were to compare them, Transnet and all of them, they all have been in the same trajectory.
Yeah, and I was about to actually come to that, Mpho. Here we find another SOE having to go to Parliament to go and explain itself in terms of why it is actually running at a loss. What does it say about the state of our SOEs, where the SABC is now one of them, reporting on losses being made for this financial year?
I think the question that follows ought to be what is unique about the SABC? What is it that because we can have the broad we can analyze them broadly to say, well, they are all state-owned entities or they belong to the state, in as much as they ought to not be ran in the same logic, especially when you consider the history of the SABC under apartheid. The question that we should be deliberating on, and I think this really, it's something that the African government, the ANC itself, ought to think about, to say, this question has come up time and again. The ANC has made promises I remember in the Mangaung conference, that was one of the deliberations, to say they are going to really, via the fact that they are in government or have been in government since the advent of democracy, are going to ensure that the SABC is independent, it's resourced. So I think in many ways, yes, some of the state-owned entities have not been capacitated and so on. We can draw those connections, but when it comes to the SABC, the question of the function of media in society is a very critical one. Yeah. Primarily when you consider the fact that, for example, we have the World Cup starting now, and you have this tiff that's happening between MultiChoice and the SABC. The question that we should be asking is around how can we find a long-term sustainable solution, primarily when we consider the fact that the SABC is uniquely positioned compared to the other state-owned entities.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thank you so much for your contributions, Mpho. That is Mpho Ndaba, media and society researcher.